Hey guys, now in this video let's discuss Azure CLI further. So we will discuss why we should use Azure CLI. Then we will discuss when we should choose between Azure CLI versus ARM template versus Terraform. See guys, Azure CLI, ARM template and Terraform, all these are used to create Azure resources. But then we will discuss at high level when we should use which one. Then we will run Azure CLI command from within Azure portal, and we will create a virtual machine using Azure CLI command. See guys, in our previous video we used Azure CLI command from PowerShell terminal, that is from Windows machine, and from Bash terminal, that is from Linux machine. But now in this video we will run Azure CLI command from within Azure portal. Now guys, if you remember, we have been discussing that irrespective of whether we run Azure CLI command from PowerShell shell or from Bash shell, the command remains same. But that is exactly not 100% true, and sometimes the command may differ. Actually, there is a very small difference and we can say that the command remains same. But in this video, we will see a simple example that such Azure command differs slightly when we run it on Bash and when we run it on PowerShell. But at high level, you can say that Azure CLI command remains same on Bash and PowerShell. Now guys, let's discuss why we should use Azure CLI. So the first one is Azure CLI command remains same irrespective of whether we run it from PowerShell or from Bash. Then we can use it for automation, that is for automating creation of Azure resources. So for example guys, let's say you want to create a VM. So of course you can create that VM from Azure portal, right? So it may take, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes for you to create that VM. But let's say as a DevOps engineer, you might be working in multiple projects. So say there are 2 or 3 more projects who also want to create the same VM. Obviously the configuration and VM name that may change, but then 80 or 90% of the fields, they are same. So every time creating it from Azure portal, probably it's not a good idea. So what you can do is you can use Azure CLI to create a VM. So every time you have to create a new VM, you will change only the related fields in that script, that is from that CLI script. So for example, VM name or let's say configuration. Then we can integrate Azure CLI commands in our CI/CD pipelines. So again, here as well, we can use Azure CLI command to create resources in our CI/CD pipelines. And then the fourth is number of errors are reduced. Now let's say guys, we have to create 3 or 4 VMs. So obviously we can create it from Azure portal. But when we are creating Azure VMs like that from Azure portal, chances are there that we may make some slight mistake, right? But then when we are creating VM using Azure CLI script, the chances of errors are less. And now let's discuss when we should use Azure CLI versus ARM template versus Terraform. So again guys, Azure CLI, ARM template and Terraform, all these are used to create Azure resources. Now the first thing is we should use Azure CLI for simple tasks or for creating simple resources, and we should use ARM for creating complex tasks or for creating complex resources. But guys, you might be having a question, what exactly is meant by simple task and this complex task, right? So let's say an example. So let's say you want to create a web app for which app service plan is already available. So you just need to create a simple web app. So in that case, you can go with Azure CLI. But let's say you have to create a web app which actually does not have app service plan, so you create app service plan as well. Then you also want to create VNet, and plus you want to create private endpoint. So again guys, if you don't know what is this private endpoint and all, that's okay, you can simply ignore that. But my point is, when you have to create such complex resource, so Azure CLI is not a good option and you should go with ARM template. then mostly we should use Azure CLI for creating temporary resources or for temporary deployments. For example, in our CI/CD pipeline, we want to test something, so we may create a resource and then we may delete a resource. So in that case, yes, we can use Azure CLI, but we should use ARM template for infrastructure as a code scenario. So this is our long-term deployment. So generally in Azure DevOps, that is in our CI/CD pipelines, we go with ARM templates. But guys, then when we should use Terraform? See guys, in simple words, you can consider that Terraform, it is an alternative to ARM. But when we have to work with different cloud providers like AWS, Google Cloud or Azure, so in such case we should go with Terraform. Then there is something called state tracking. So when we need state tracking, then we can go ahead with Terraform. So guys, again, what is this state tracking? Probably this is the out of scope for this video, but then at high level you can consider that when we want to work with different cloud providers and when we want state tracking, we can go ahead with Terraform. But basically Terraform is an alternative to ARM templates. So at high level, Azure CLI is for creating simple resources, ARM is for creating complex resources or for complex tasks, and then Terraform when we want to work with multiple cloud providers. And now let's try to run Azure CLI commands from within Azure portal. Okay, so now guys, we are in Azure and please follow my mouse. See this icon, it says Cloud Shell. So let's click on it. And guys, now we are connected to Cloud Shell. And observe this, it says switch to PowerShell. That means now we are working in Bash shell. That means behind the scene we have Linux environment. Now if I say switch to PowerShell, then again we will switch to PowerShell. So that means behind the scene at that time we will have Windows environment. Now guys, how to create a VM using Azure CLI command? So for that, so guys, here we are in new browser and let's search for Azure CLI. I will say search. Let's open this first link. Now guys, on the left hand side, let's go down. Can you see these samples? Let's expand this. And now here, let's search for virtual machines. See this virtual machines. Let's expand this. I will say Windows VMs. And now here we can see Azure CLI samples to create virtual machines. And let's open this, that is create VM quick. I will say create Windows VM quick. And see this, we have this Azure CLI script to create a Windows VM. So let's actually copy it. And now guys, I have already copied in Notepad, and in the interest of the time I have updated this admin password, and then I have given the name to this VM, that is name is my VM using CLI. Okay, so let's actually copy this command, and if you see, it will first create this resource group, and then in this resource group it will create this VM. So let's copy it and I will paste it over here. Let's say enter. So guys, now we may need to wait for some time for this VM to get created. And now guys, in new tab, if I click on virtual machines, as of now our VM is not created. So again, let's wait. If I refresh again and see the status, it's creating. Now guys, you might be having a question where we can see this deployment in progress, that is where we can see this status, right? So we can see it under Azure Monitor. So let me just duplicate this tab. Here I will say Monitor. I will say Activity Log. and here if I say last 1 hour, I'll say apply, and see guys, this creating or updating virtual network a minute ago, updating resource group 2 minutes ago, right? So if I expand this, see, it's creating this virtual network. So basically under Azure Monitor, under activity log, we can see the status of Azure CLI command which we just executed. Now here it was saying VM is being created. I'll say refresh, and you see now it says VM is running. So let's actually open it, and yes, it looks like now our VM has been created. Okay, and now if you remember, we created a resource group as well, and the resource group is this one, rg-cli demo. So let's see what other resources are created in this resource group. Okay, so I'll say home, resource groups, see this RG CLI demo, and see guys, virtual machine, disk, then public IP, virtual network, all these resources are also got created. Okay, so guys, basically this is how you can find Azure CLI script from official Microsoft documentation. Now guys, we just discussed at the beginning of this video that sometimes there is a slight difference in Azure CLI command which we execute on Windows or which we execute on Linux, right? That is on Bash or PowerShell. So let's quickly see a simple example. Now guys, can you see these two commands? So this is the command which will work on Bash, and this is the command which will work on PowerShell. Now guys, if you observe these two commands, we are simply displaying the details of resource group. See this RG, it is resource group, and this is also resource group, right? But when we are executing this command in Bash, we have to specify RG is equal to resource group name. But when we are running this command on PowerShell, we have to specify $RG is equal to. So that's the so basically there is a difference when we are working with variables. See, this RG is nothing but a variable, right? So now this is the PowerShell command, right? So if I copy this, and now guys, see this, we are currently in Bash shell. See, it says switch to PowerShell. That means we are currently in Bash shell. So if I run this command in Bash shell, it's not gonna work. So in the interest of the time, I'm not going to run this command, but basically I just wanted to show that when we are working with variables, and then there are a couple of minor scenarios as well, that in such scenarios Azure CLI command may differ when we run it in Bash or PowerShell environment. So basically that's it guys for this video. Thanks for listening.